boils and ghouls. In this series, we're going to be taking a look at one of the most underrated artists of all time, in my opinion. While he's a well-known artist, he's avoided lengthy runs on titles and eschewed higher-paying work on superheroes for more science fiction and adventure-oriented material throughout his career. While he might not be inordinately partial to the superhero genre, though, Michael Golden is without a doubt one of the most interesting, enigmatic, and influential artists of the half-past century in the medium, and this despite only having produced what amounts to a smattering of comics in a career spanning more than 4 decades at this point. Starting at Marvel and DC in the late 1970s before becoming a fan favorite and carving out a niche of his own as one of the most bitingly original illustrators to have ever worked in the field, with his groundbreaking runs on both the Micronauts and The Nam in the 1980s, Michael Golden has only ever done a handful of interviews during his entire career as well, and even many dedicated fans don't know much about the actual man behind the drawings or the stories surrounding the comics that made him a living legend. From his heights in the 1980s and early 90s as one of the most highly sought after cover artists in the industry, to his on-again off-again relationship with the industry and sudden disappearance, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the career of one of the most interesting men to have ever picked up the pen. So kick back for another tasty tidbit of tawdry industry trivia and a little tale I like to call Michael Golden, Patience is a Virue. Remember, if you enjoy this video, do me a favor and hit that like button. Think about getting in the comments section below and letting me know if you really enjoy what you see. Make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you feel like you're in a position to support the channel and help it grow, think about using the link in the description to sign up for my Patreon page, sign up for membership right here on YouTube, or pick up your very own JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen. But now, let's get into it. After a well-received Doctor Strange backup some months earlier in April of 1981, Michael Golden unleashed what is widely considered one of the greatest comics ever drawn, Avengers Annual 10, on the world, introducing fans to his and Chris Claremont's co-creation, the malicious mutant known as Rogue, for the first time in the process only a few months later in November of that same year. While Rogue is widely considered one of the most important members of the X-Men today, and she's gone on to become an extremely popular character over the years, what's really funny about Avengers Annual 10 is that despite both Michael Golden and Chris Claremont's involvement, the book had very few reasons to do well and so many to fail. Following his departure from the Micronauts series in December of 1979, after continuous disputes with writer Bill Mantlo, as well as clashes with both he and Jim Shooter over the art and general direction of the series, Michael Golden had meant to basically make a graceful exit from the industry for the most part. Despite this, he kept agreeing to random covers and backups, mostly for Al Milgrom and Larry Hama, who could basically talk him into that kind of stuff because they were friends. It had been some time since Michael Golden had done any real interiors by this point, and it would only in fact be due to a set of rather fortuitous events, along with a misunderstanding on his end, that would actually lead Michael Golden to even agree to do the work to begin with. His interiors for Avengers Annual 10 in November of 1981, regarded as one of the single greatest Avengers and X-Men books ever produced, despite not even actually being an X-Men book, would truly cement Michael Golden as a legend among the comics industry once and for all. While extremely fondly remembered today, the road to Avengers Annual 10, as was almost invariably the case with just about anything that Michael Golden worked on, was especially rife with troubles from the very onset. One of the many problems that plagued the issue was the fact that the actual story for Avengers Annual 10 picks up directly from issue 25 of Ms. Marvel. That issue introduced Rogue and set up the events that were to transpire in the Avengers Annual well enough from what I understand, but there was one major problem with all of that. The Miss Marvel series had been prematurely canceled and issue 25 never even came out. While the comic was never printed, the story from Miss Marvel 25 had been pretty meticulously planned out and conceived of as part of a much larger arc. As a result, the writer, Chris Claremont, was dead set on using it despite the Miss Marvel issue in question never actually getting released, or drawn for that matter. While Miss Marvel 25 was plotted and Chris Claremont had a pretty solid idea of what he wanted to happen, to the best of my knowledge, the art was never even started since the series was canceled with issue 23, 2 issues prior to the one which was supposed to introduce Rogue. As such, there was a great deal of preliminary work that Michael Golden had to undertake before he could even start drawing anything. While both Dave Cockrum and Mike Vosberg had been working on Miss Marvel just prior to its cancellation, it's unclear which one of them would have provided the concept work that did exist for Rogue, although it would most likely have been Mike Vosberg, who'd seemingly taken over art duties from Dave Cockrum with issue 22 in February of 1979. I guess it really doesn't matter, as according to all accounts, Rogue's design had never been refined or even really fleshed out for that matter. Michael Golden recalls that there was something of a rough sketch of her costume that was given to him when he started working on designing Rogue, but it was just a tattered sheet of paper, and he says it wasn't much more than a generic woman in a quote-unquote sort of futuristic jogging suit. While the fact that Rogue hadn't been designed meant that there was a little bit more legwork that he had to do, it also allowed Michael Golden much more freedom to create the character. With so little to go on from the previous artists, though, Michael Golden turned to Chris Claremont for direction as to how she was going to look and where they wanted to take her instead. Although, by all accounts, this process did not go how either one of these two men planned. Now, not to diminish his efforts, but even by Michael Golden's own admission, he didn't put an inordinate amount of work into designing Rogue. She was conceived of and considered as something of a one-off toss-away at the time, or at least that's how Michael Golden perceived the work, which is painfully clear when he discusses how he actually ended up coming up with Rogue's design. Apparently, when Michael Golden called to discuss the character with Chris Claremont and get a feeling for how he wanted Rogue to look, Claremont repeatedly told Michael Golden that he wanted her to look like a woman named Grace Jones. After some further conversations, which contained continual references to the same woman, Michael Golden eventually managed to surmise that Jones was a woman, and that she had short crew-cut hair with white streaks running through it. Aside from this, though, Michael Golden had no clue who Grace Jones was or what she looked like. While he's never explained precisely why, after a few conversations, Michael Golden was either too embarrassed to tell Chris Claremont that he didn't know who Grace Jones was, or maybe he didn't think it was an inordinately big deal, having discerned what he believed were the defining aspects that Chris Claremont wanted to include from her likeness anyways. It's important to remember that this was in a time before the internet, and you couldn't just look stuff up nearly as easily as you can today. Michael Golden could have gone to a record store and bought, or at least looked at a Grace Jones album, considering how many times Chris Claremont referred to her though. But he didn't. Instead, after initial conversations with Chris Claremont about who the character was and what he wanted to accomplish with the story, Michael Golden, for whatever reason, decided to just take the major defining characteristics that Chris Claremont had kept pointing out and run with them. When it came to her costume, this mostly equated to Rogue being unable to touch people due to her mutant power. Golden therefore had her covered from head to toe, adding gloves and a hood to the quote-unquote jogging suit design that he was initially given. When it came to her physical appearance, it was essentially the major defining aspects of what he had taken away from his conversations with Chris Claremont concerning Grace Jones' appearance that we've talked about, namely short crew-cut hair featuring the bizarre white streaks that Claremont had made repeated mention of. As it turned out, however, Golden had missed a pretty major aspect of Grace Jones' appearance, which Claremont probably hadn't even thought to mention during their conversations, likely believing that Michael Golden was aware of who she was since he hadn't spoken up to the contrary. And if you're not aware, as I'm sure many of you are not, as it turns out, Grace Jones was actually a super popular Jamaican singer, model, and actress. That's right. Rogue wasn't actually intended as the sweet Southern belle that she ended up becoming at all. She was actually intended to be another black female character like Storm to round out Claremont's ever-expanding roster of diverse characters. Well, as I mentioned, he did add gloves and a hood, as well as generally spice up the original jogging suit design. This mix-up, having to do with Rogue's skin color, would ironically end up being Michael Golden's big contribution to the character. Had he not made the mistake, there's no telling what they would have done with Rogue moving forward, or if she would have ever even showed up again for that matter. While he wasn't responsible for an inordinate amount of what we know of as Rogue today, he was awarded co-creator status along with Chris Claremont for the character at the time, though Michael Golden readily admits that most of what's been done with the character, including her personality and the refinement of her costume and her general appearance, has been handled by Chris Claremont and others besides himself much further down the line. Interestingly, despite his statements regarding Rogue being something of a throwaway, as well as his reluctance to accept any amount of serious credit when it comes to the character that we know and love as Rogue today, Michael Golden had to have been aware she had some potential back in 1981. I say this because when the issue was originally released, he had the foresight and the balls to do what very few other people would have dared then or today. Michael Golden pressed Marvel for and was actually awarded not only co-creator status, but participation points for the character. And if you're wondering how the hell Michael Golden managed to pull this off, I have a few guesses. The most likely is that Marvel was in the earliest stages of what would soon become an extraordinarily protracted and, more importantly, public dispute with Jack Kirby. The controversy centered around the return of original art from Marvel and relinquishment of rights pertaining to any and all work that Jack Kirby had ever done for them in perpetuity that he may have still had any claims to. In short, Marvel was refusing to return original art to Jack Kirby unless he signed a special agreement, and when he refused to do so, things got really ugly really quick. Kirby's supporters almost immediately took the battle public, and the ensuing fallout would not only permanently stain Marvel's reputation with fans and professionals alike, but turn Jack Kirby into a full-blown martyr of the comic industry almost overnight. And if you want to learn more about this entire situation, I'll make sure to stick a link to my Jack Kirby Lord of Light documentary in the description below, as well as my documentary about the Great Marvel Art Heist, which goes into the disappearance of some of the most important comic book art ever made from the Marvel warehouse, which just so happened to take place during this dispute over original art. The pertinent thing here for this Michael Golden video is that Marvel was starting to look like assholes to the general public who adore Jack Kirby and were getting increasingly vocal about his mistreatment. Despite his reprehensible reception by people inside of the industry while he was involved with it, once Jack Kirby left mainstream comics for the first time in 1978, there was an almost instantaneous backlash over his treatment from many of these same people. Suddenly, both fans and creatives were in agreement that Marvel's treatment of Jack Kirby had been deplorable at best and predatory at worst. These were the inevitable parallels being drawn to Superman's creators, Siegel and Schuster, and his treatment, and Marvel had seen how things turned out for DC when that had hit the mainstream media. While they were not quite in full swing yet, things were certainly starting to turn sour for Marvel by 1981, and there was a brazen wave of new creators who weren't content with the same crappy deals that had been doled out to the likes of Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby before them. likely largely as a result of the intense scrutiny being leveled at Marvel, particularly when it came to their payment of the people who were actually responsible for coming up with the characters and the stories that you saw and read. There were some, not many, but some creators who actually managed to secure halfway decent participation deals pertaining to their work at Marvel during this period, despite being employed under the now dreaded work for hire contracts. One of these lucky few, Golden, brazen and forward-thinking as always, managed to negotiate what he refers to in interviews as quote-unquote participation money from Marvel for the Rogue character. And listening to Michael Golden talk about all of this, which he doesn't do all that often, is actually really interesting. Michael Golden is a big believer that you should be aware of the potential of whatever it is that you are doing at the time and make agreements based on that then and there. He has little sympathy for anyone foolish enough to sign away their work without a second thought, and says that you need to be thinking 5 steps ahead when doing this kind of work. You can't just shoot yourself in the foot by being unreasonable and asking for the moon, but you can't just give stuff away either. Mindful of people like Jack Kirby who had come before him, Michael Golden says that he negotiated upfront for the agreement he has in place with Marvel regarding payments deriving from Rogue. What I did not know is that apparently Marvel doesn't actually pay royalties to their creators. They actually have completely different agreements for artists and writers, payments referred to as participation instead. And in case you're curious like I was, from what I can tell, having looked at a few contracts and talked to several professionals, participation seems to be nothing more than another legal way of distancing Michael Golden, or anyone else for that matter, from any legal claims or rights that they might have to a given character or story that they create while working for Marvel, regardless of payments from the company or not. I'm not entirely sure if there's some sort of already agreed upon payments of allotted amounts when characters are used, or if it works more like traditional royalties while essentially operating under a different name so as to legally differentiate the two, but they do seem to be distinctly and legally different from other types of royalty agreements in the publication world. In newer agreements of this sort, the wording is specifically structured so as to make it abundantly clear that Marvel is not actually even legally bound to pay the creator anything, and that whatever they do choose to send is totally their call and entirely reliant on the creator agreeing to follow a set of stipulations regarding appearances and promotion of the work in most cases. This is most certainly not the case for Michael Golden, who wasn't making any appearances, let alone doing any promotional work for his titles, and still manages to make a tidy sum off of the character to this day. While I don't know the specifics of the agreement that Golden entered into with Marvel regarding Rogue, it's clear that his ability to think about things most other people don't, as well as his outspoken nature, worked out really well for him here. She might not be making him a millionaire, but at a 2021 panel, Michael Golden said that he'd paid for the brand new Camaro he drove to the convention in cash using one of the participation checks for Rogue, and a 2021 Camaro would set you back anywhere between $30,000 and $70,000, so it's definitely not nothing. Considering what Marvel makes on the character a year, it's a drop in the bucket, but it's still a lot more than you usually see most people getting. I think this push for participation rights, which was far from the norm in 1981, may have worked out well for Michael Golden financially at the time, but also ruffled some feathers, further complicating Michael Golden's working relationship with Marvel in the future, although this is purely stipulation on my end. However, this would go a long way in explaining why there are so many whispered stories that precede Michael Golden, despite the fact I only found a handful of incidents on record where he did much of anything to earn the reputation that he has today. In fact, DC had almost immediately let Golden onto one of their biggest characters in the form of Batman almost right out of the gate, and while he had only been allowed to play with a few of Marvel's big guns, the Avengers Annual held the promise of allowing him to draw some of their biggest characters as well. Wanting to do higher profile work on some of Marvel's bigger characters, Golden had recently set up a Spider-Man project that had fallen through on him, and apparently the only reason that he actually agreed to do the Avengers Annual was because when they called to offer him an Avengers Annual, Michael Golden foolishly assumed that the Avengers would be featured in it. If you've ever read Avengers Annual 10, however, you'll know that Rogue takes out Captain America, Thor, and Iron Man, the only characters that Michael Golden was familiar with or interested in drawing, featured in the entire book, and the sole reason that he agreed to do the annual in a matter of about 2 pages. The rest of the comic is populated mostly with X-Men and other Claremont adjacent characters. Characters which Michael Golden says he literally had no knowledge of. Much like Golden's ignorance of who Grace Jones was, this would both complicate things greatly as well as add to the flavor of the finished product in a lot of ways, I think. Where Golden's ignorance of certain characters might not have been nearly as problematic in a lot of other situations, Claremont was firmly entrenched in the Marvel method of writing by this point, and Golden says that there was essentially no script for 99% of the story. Golden recalls Claremont's only real interest apparently lay in the ending, saying that there was, quote, like 1 page for the first 24 pages and then 24 pages for the last 8, which he described as consisting of almost panel by panel breakdowns for the big action scene and everything following it, with the Avengers meeting at the mansion to have their big heartfelt talk. Michael Golden could handle talking heads. He was good at talking heads. And if it had just been a matter of Michael Golden having to go out and look up reference for how a few people had looked or something like that, he might have been okay. But he literally had no idea who the majority of the characters in this book were. And even when he did, he had little clue as to what their powers were, how those powers worked, or even how the characters acted in general. For all of his tendencies to get so mired down in small details when it comes to his art and get things looking perfect, Michael Golden doesn't appear to suffer from anything of the sort when it comes to working on characters that he's unfamiliar with. Perhaps because the Avengers he'd actually wanted to draw weren't featured in the issue, or maybe because he'd already had to guess at who Grace Jones was for Rogue's design, Michael Golden decided to just double down and power through things rather than labor over small things like looking up reference or figuring out everyone's powers, and just do the best job that he possibly could with the information that he had. In the end, despite hours of conversations with Chris Claremont about the characters and the story, not only did Rogue end up the wrong race, but because he didn't use reference, Michael Golden also left Chris Claremont in the extraordinarily unenviable position of having to quite literally write his way around Michael Golden's numerous mistakes. If you actually look at the art, divorcing it from the writing in Avengers Annual 10, there are people using powers incorrectly, and even ones that they didn't really have, while other characters inexplicably look or act entirely differently than they ever had before. While Claremont obviously pulled it together, and honestly, looking at this issue, I would never have guessed that Michael Golden didn't know what he was doing. I cannot imagine that it was a walk in the park for Chris Claremont, and I know that it was not a super fun time for Michael Golden. This wasn't only due to the fact that he found the whole thing to be rather needlessly stressful in his opinion, but in Michael Golden's eyes, it was yet another situation where Marvel employed a bait and switch tactic, in this case offering him an Avengers Annual with no Avengers in it. While the Avengers Annual definitely wasn't easy for Michael Golden, and at the time he wasn't extraordinarily pleased with having to figure so many things out on the fly, the issue would firmly cement Michael Golden as one of the preeminent artists of his era, making him even more in demand than ever before. Golden has also actually repeatedly said that Chris Claremont is one of only 2 great writers that he's ever worked with, despite the problems on the issue. Golden says that Gail Simone is the best storyteller that he's ever had the pleasure of working with. Chris Claremont, however, is without a doubt the master of characters and dialogue in his opinion, though. In Golden's eyes, Claremont's ability to put the right words in the mouths of the right characters at the right time in order to properly guide and progress the story is absolutely unparalleled. This is again extremely important to Michael Golden, who sees himself as more of a storyteller than a traditional artist, and almost precisely what seems to attract Golden to Charles Dickens' work, who he cites as a major influence on his work as well. Because Michael Golden sees his art as a way to tell a story more than an excuse to just draw cool-looking images, and because he believes great storytelling can only be achieved through the usage of characters, he and Chris Claremont seem to work really well together, despite Claremont's reliance on the Marvel method and Michael Golden's usual distaste for that style of writing. They've done several things together over the years, and following this, Michael Golden was even set to do the graphic novel adaptation of Chris Claremont's novel First Flight in the early 1990s. That is before Michael Golden had to back out due to scheduling conflicts, and then the entire project was eventually scrapped altogether. Michael Golden had always been motivated more by telling good stories than anything else, but it was during this period in the early 1980s that Michael Golden really began to experiment with his page layouts and begun evolving into a serious creator with his own unique voice in the process. And this despite his fairly limited output, making it all the more impressive. While most people would agree that Michael Golden was really coming into his own as an artist, pushing his art to places it had never gone before, and producing some of the best work in his entire career, rather ironically, much of this seems to have occurred because Michael Golden doesn't actually care about his art looking cool or attractive. According to Michael Golden, everything he does is in service of the story and ensuring that it's clear and easy to read. It's far more important to Michael Golden that people are able to, quote unquote, participate in the drama of the story through the characters, as he puts it, than just making jaw-dropping art with a bunch of cool panels and big splash pages. If this happens to look pretty and people enjoy them when he's done and told the story, all the better. But from everything that I've ever read and all that I can tell, this has never been one of his goals or even something that necessarily enters into Michael Golden's mind when he's actually working on a story. Regardless, if you look at the little bit of long-form material that Michael Golden was putting out during this time, the stupendous evolutionary leaps in his art are undeniably evident. With this continued expansion of his artistic repertoire, as well as the widely heralded release of the Avengers annual, one would have hoped that Michael Golden found new footing in the industry and was finally given the workload and breathing space that he so sorely appeared to deserve. Unfortunately, following the release of Avengers Annual 10, things kind of went back to normal in a lot of ways, and Michael Golden wasn't doing an inordinate amount of work in the comic book industry, aside from the regular covers and short backups and random books that he'd been producing on and off since departing the Micronauts. While he might not have been doing a lot, as always, he was producing some really interesting stuff, like his series of Duck World shorts for the Howard the Duck magazine, as well as a short story for DC in issue 88 of their series Ghosts called The Phantom City that he did for old friend Joe Orlando, who was editing it. Michael Golden also provided one of the most fondly remembered single-page images in Star Wars history with the ice trenches of Hoth for issue 43 of the Marvel series in January of 1981, and he had a short story for Mystery in Space, Trouble in Paradise as well. The Logan's Run story he completed when originally hired on at Marvel full-time was also finally seeing publication in Bizarre Adventures as the Golden circles around this time in March of that same year, although it had to be almost entirely reworked so as not to actually feature any of the characters from Logan's Run, which Marvel had long since lost the rights to by this point. In March of 1982, a little under a year after his work on Avengers Annual 10, Michael Golden would release yet another of his career-defining stories, one that we've already talked a little bit about, as work on this particular tale had begun years earlier. Sometime around this period, in late 1981 or early 1982, Al Milgrom came up with the idea for an entirely different kind of comic book, envisioning a much higher quality book than the others that the company was putting out at the time in nearly every regard when it came to Marvel publications. While most comics were filled with ads, Al Milgrom felt that they weren't just distracting, but that they could actually break up the natural flow of the art and storytelling and really serve to undermine the impact of the book in a lot of ways. Despite this, while they might have been kind of a pain in the neck, ads were also seen as a necessary evil, considering how much potential revenue they can generate for a publication. Because of this, it was a widely accepted fact that you needed the ad revenue to put out comics, and that there simply wasn't much way around this. However, when Al Milgrom subsequently discovered that the ads in comic books actually made so little money that they were essentially used in order to help offset a small portion of the printing costs, he quickly approached Jim Shooter with the idea for what would become Marvel Fanfare. Due to the lack of income that they were providing, as well as his distaste for them to begin with, Al Milgrom suggested that his proposed series do away with ads altogether and nominally raise the cover price a little bit so as to offset the lost ad revenue. He didn't stop there though. Al Milgrom also wanted the cover price increased to finance a higher quality book when it came to the printing process as well. Marvel Fanfare would be presented on a thicker, higher quality paper stock than normal newsprint utilized at the time, and employ a much more accurate, complex, and expensive color reproduction technique. If this weren't enough, when Jim Shooter asked how exactly Al Milgrom thought he was going to convince people to spend the extra money on Marvel Fanfare rather than other much more established books offered at a lower price point, Milgrom answered that the book was also going to feature the biggest and best creators in the industry, pulling in readers not only from all of those other titles that they may have been associated with, but new ones unique to Fanfare as well once the series got rolling. In order to achieve this, Milgrom suggested that they also use the increased cover price to offer higher page rates for people working on the series, hiring only the cream of the crop from the onset. To this day, I'm not entirely sure how Al Milgrom managed to sell Jim Shooter on the idea of Marvel Fanfare. It was fanciful, forward, and utterly wishful thinking when it came to a series. It sounds amazing on paper, but as soon as you start looking at the practical aspects of putting something like this out, it becomes absolutely shocking that the series managed to limp along for nearly 9 years. But it did, and when Jim Shooter astoundingly agreed to greenlight Marvel Fanfare, Al Milgrom immediately knew precisely the story that he wanted to kick the series off with too. We discussed it in part in the last episode, but the story in question, Fast Descent into Hell by Michael Golden, and none other than Chris Claremont, was actually originally intended for an issue of Marvel Team Up. It had been at least mostly completed more than a year prior to March of 1982 when it wound up finally seeing publication, and it had only sat because, according to Michael Golden, it was too good. Michael Golden says that when he turned in Fast Descent into Hell, Al Milgrom exclaimed that the story was simply too good to just end up languishing in some random issue of Marvel Team Up or any other random book for that matter. On the other hand, Al Milgrom really didn't know what else to do with it at the time either, and so Fast Descent into Hell had sat in Milgrom's desk drawer for months while he tried to figure out what the heck to do with the story. With the launch of Marvel Fanfare, however, Milgrom now finally felt he had a place to properly showcase the story. Because the work was being done for Marvel Fanfare, and the entire point of the book was to allow the best writers and artists in the entire industry a good place to show off the full extent of their talents, Milgrom not only had Michael Golden ink himself, which is always a good thing, at least when he can manage to get it done. But he even let Michael Golden color his own work, as he had on Micronauts in many cases a few years prior. A seemingly small thing to some people, when Golden is allowed to not only ink but color himself, it adds immensely to the quality of whatever Golden happens to be working on. This was a well-known fact to a lot of Michael Golden fans even at the time, but funnily enough, while he had definitely colored sporadic material in the past, some of which we've even talked about and looked at, Fast Descent into Hell would be the first time that Michael Golden actually received proper official credit for this work. This added level of creative freedom was just the kind of leeway that Golden was always looking for. Unfortunately, by this point, even getting him to agree to do the story was not easy, though. Michael Golden was and had been busy with commercial art for some time. He'd only really done a small smattering of comic work that we've talked about since he left Micronauts almost 2 years before, and it was pretty obvious to anyone paying any attention that Michael Golden wasn't all that keen on returning to the field in a serious capacity anytime soon. Fast Descent into Hell was already written and penciled though, so all Michael Golden had to do was go back and ink and color the work. The thing was, Fast Descent into Hell was intended as the first of a 4-part serialized story that Claremont had planned with Golden as artist. Fast Descent into Hell was completely penciled as far as I know, but the other 3 parts of the story still had to be done from top to bottom. After what appears to be no small amount of prodding, Golden eventually agreed to draw the second part of the story, To Sacrifice My Soul, for Marvel fanfare, but would never end up completing the 3rd or 4th chapters of the quadrilogy, sadly. When Michael Golden refused to do the rest of the series, Milgrom was forced to call in legendary X-Men artist and original Micronauts cover artist Dave Cockrum for Part 3, as well as the new kid on the block, Paul Smith, who would quickly become a fan favorite on the Uncanny X-Men for Part 4. While he might not have finished all 4 parts, he did agree to do the second installment. That is after no small amount of cajoling from Al Milgrom, apparently. All told, there's almost a year and a half between the first and second parts of Descent into Hell, and you can tell there is a chasm of artistic differences between Fast Descent into Hell, started in 1980, and the second installment, To Sacrifice My Soul, published in issue 2 of Marvel Fanfare in May of 1982. Similarly, Golden also had 2 other stories, Mind Game and Ordeal, published in issue 4 of Marvel Fanfare, that read much more like Fast Descent into Hell than his contemporaneous work of this period. If you examine these other 2 stories, it's not difficult to surmise that they were likely done around the same time as Fast Descent into Hell, if not before. And the stories had simply been stuffed into some random drawer ever since their completion years prior for one reason or another. It is possible that the Deathlock story was new. However, Michael Golden specifically references being assigned and completing an Iron Man story when he first went to Marvel in 1976 in several interviews, despite that work never seeing publication prior to this. Considering many of the stories from Fanfare were pulled either from files or storage, it only makes sense that this unpublished Iron Man material in question and the Ordeal story are one and the same. If this is true and both stories were previously completed, which strongly appears to be the case, this means that aside from this Cask of Amontillado, which Golden did for the Pit and the Pendulum issue of Marvel Classic Comics and 2 issues of The Defenders, nearly every single other piece of work he was assigned by Marvel between 1976 and 1977 ended up sitting for a number of years before seeing publication in random publications after his success on the Micronauts series and subsequent exit from the industry for the most part over the next several years. Despite having left the industry for the most part, Golden apparently had something of a hankering to come back and do at least some serious comic book work by this point in May of 1982, at least to a certain extent. While he wasn't necessarily very interested in To Sacrifice My Soul per se, Golden explains that he and Al Milgrom were friends by this point, and he simply wore Michael Golden down after repeatedly asking him to do work, eventually catching him, quote-unquote, on a good day. As it turns out, though, there were indeed some other rather interesting motives behind Golden's eventual agreement to do the Marvel fanfare story, aside from Milgrom catching him on a good day, if my research is correct. Golden has stated that at the time he believed a great deal of the problems that he was encountering in the comics industry were due to his own, shall we say, less than amicable attitude. This isn't because Michael Golden is needlessly problematic or anything, in my opinion, but he really stressed and sweated the small stuff that I don't think many professionals really worry themselves over or even think about in a lot of cases. This proved to be a constant source of friction with other creatives who were used to a much more hands-off relationship with their collaborators in most cases. As it should be evident by this point, Michael Golden is and always has been extremely involved with the projects that he's working on. And because he holds himself to such a high standard and expects so much out of himself, he naturally expects the same out of those around him. In an industry where a lot of people are just doing what they can to get by and make deadlines and couldn't care less about the quality of what they're putting out, this didn't always go over well. Some people considered his interests in different aspects of production that others ignored, as Michael Golden simply thinking that they were incompetent or couldn't do their jobs, which, while sometimes true, I don't think was necessarily always the case. Yes, he's demanding. Yes, he's often dissatisfied with numerous aspects of the material that he's involved in putting out. However, I think it's rather important to note that this displeasure in what he sees in his publications often includes his own work. Michael Golden simply seems to be a demanding guy who expects a lot from those he works with, as well as himself, and refuses to compromise his artistic integrity when he thinks he's in the right. I can both respect the hell out of this as well as understand how it would be more than a little bit frustrating to deal with someone like this, especially if you're just trying to get a monthly comic book out on time. Meeting a deadline is virtually impossible when there's someone treating every single panel like a piece of fine art to be analyzed and examined, scrutinized over, every small detail ad nauseum. Acknowledging this voracious appetite for control, as well as his sometimes abrasive attitudes towards collaborators, to say the least, Michael Golden had come to believe he was his quote-unquote own greatest obstacle when it came to the industry. He sought to rectify this by quote-unquote playing ball, which Golden apparently interpreted as accepting the offer to do the follow-up to the Fast Descent to Hell story, despite his obvious displeasure that the story had rather inexplicably sat in a drawer for more than 18 months. At the time, Michael Golden says he thought that if he could just force himself to get out there and do a bit more grunt work, maybe acquiesce some and work with people a little bit, not only would he be a lot happier, but those around him would be as well. Ironically, while completely disinterested in the work, To Sacrifice My Soul for issue 2 went off without a hitch. The next story he would take on for Marvel Fanfare, however, would drive Michael Golden to his absolute breaking point and beyond. Michael Golden had hoped that doing some more collaborative work, which involved giving more power over to other people, would help him overcome the problems he seemed to be repeatedly facing, as well as perhaps curtail his growing reputation as being rather difficult and slow to work with. Instead, the ordeal would only simply serve to further reinforce his belief that comics were an infantile industry run by a bunch of wannabe celebrities and artistes who didn't really care about the quality of the material that they were creating or about their fellow collaborators in a lot of cases. Needless to say, This next story for Marvel fanfare would become legendarily FUBAR, and you guessed it, wouldn't see print for years either. To Golden's credit, when referencing work on this particular story, I could not find a single interview where Michael Golden would actually use the name of the party he got along so badly with. Not because he was being petty or childish or anything, but because even decades later, he didn't feel the need to slam on the guy or insult his name, even when addressing what went wrong and what happened with the story or his displeasure with the situation. Because he keeps saying the writer, and Bill Mantlo is credited on the completed story, I'm going to make an educated guess that's who he's referring to. Sadly, because of Bill Mantlo's unfortunate accident and subsequent health struggles, I don't think he ever got a chance to speak much, if at all, on the record regarding the specifics of the story that Michael Golden is referring to, though. That being said, Mantlo has something of a reputation in the industry himself even today, and the truth of what transpired is a little bit unclear, to be honest, as I think both men can be slightly unreliable narrators. According to Golden, what was supposed to be his next story for Marvel fanfare, a small, simple way for him to start making a more concerted effort to let go a little and be a better collaborator and get back into the comic industry by being a team player, instead turned nightmarish and frustratingly difficult. Interestingly, as is often the case when Golden is just super riled up and or has his back against the wall, this mounting tension and pressure would eventually result in one of his best and most memorable works, and one that's often still referred to as one of the greatest single issues of a comic to have ever been released, despite how utterly horrific his experiences were actually making it. Michael Golden and Bill Mantlo clearly had their fair share of problems while on Micronauts, with Michael Golden entirely walking away from the project after only a year despite its insane popularity because of the direction that Bill Mantlo wanted to take it. He respected his friend Al Milgrom though, and again believing that if he was just a little bit more of a team player, things in the industry would get a lot easier. Golden agreed to do the story, which many years later would become known as Renovation. As a side note, I also think it is worth mentioning here that while Michael Golden might have claimed that Al Milgrom just caught him on a good day, or that he was just trying to be more of a team player and get back into comics, according to at least 2 interviews I found, Michael Golden was in desperate need of a paycheck at the time as well. This meant that the usually slow and contemplative Golden was instead eager to get to work on the proposed story and may have gotten a little bit ahead of himself on this one. Golden says that as part of the writing process, per the Marvel method, he spent about 4 hours on the phone with the writer, hashing stuff out. Together, they were eventually able to come up with a fairly solid plot in his opinion, which according to Golden's accounts, he was actually laying out and thumbnailing while they talked. Needing the paycheck as quickly as possible, almost immediately after they got off the phone, Michael Golden took his roughs and thumbnails and started actually penciling the story. When he was finished a few weeks later, Golden turned the penciled pages into Marvel, vouching that the dialogue would be coming soon, explaining that he and the writer had worked out the story together already. A week passed and Golden didn't hear back from Marvel though, and then another. After more than a month of no calls from Marvel, as well as several failed attempts at contacting them to see what the problem was on his end, now even more in need of money, Golden had no choice but to simply move on to other paying projects and put the story out of mind. Michael Golden says in interviews that he did eventually get a call from Al Milgrom regarding the story, but that it was not the kind of news he was hoping for. Golden had initially hoped it was just a production delay or some other small problem, but Al Milgrom explained that the writer had called him insisting that the story Golden drew was entirely different than what they had discussed on the phone. Apparently incensed that Golden hadn't followed what he saw as the outline that they had discussed, The writer turned in dialogue for what appeared to be a completely different book than the one Michael Golden had drawn. They had even reportedly gone so far as changing the ending and entire last half of the book to the extent that Michael Golden's art no longer worked at all. If this line of events is true, I believe Al Milgrom most likely put off calling Michael Golden to discuss the problems with renovation because he knew how pissed off Golden was going to be. He perhaps hoped that giving Michael Golden a little time to forget about the project and move on to something else might help ease his temper when confronted with the fact that the art for basically half of this story that he had finished was completely unusable at this point. This, however, was not the case. According to Golden, when Al Milgrom called him up to let him know what was going on with the story and request that changes be made to the art so that they fit the script, he outright refused. Golden insisted that he had completed his art on the story as outlined in the conversation between he and the writer, and that he shouldn't be expected to go back and redo work that he'd already done in good faith. Milgrom explained that it didn't really matter. The story and the art didn't work together, and therefore the art had to be redone. Michael Golden refused again and again, eventually just telling Al Milgrom to reassign the material to someone else because he simply wasn't going to be doing it. While Michael Golden has since stated that this might not have been the best way to handle the situation, as well as perhaps even a little bit childish in his own words, he's also admitted that it was probably the smart thing to do in the long run. Michael Golden has said on a few occasions when talking about the story, which he's often asked about, if they would have sent the pages back to him, he would have quote-unquote probably just tore them up. In fact, this is apparently almost exactly what he ended up telling Al Milgrom that finally got him to leave him be about the entire thing. At least for the time being, that is, and if Golden's assertion about what he would have done with the pages sounds like hyperbole or just something said out of spite, despite the questionable validity of much of the rest of this account of things on Golden's end, let me tell you, this statement is neither. To best explain this, it has to be understood that, simply put, Michael Golden does not place the same sort of nostalgic, intrinsic, or monetary value on his original art that most other people do. As a commercial artist, once a piece has been published or served whatever purpose it was originally intended for, Michael Golden says that's it. He doesn't have a lot of attachment to his work. I came across several stories of Michael Golden selling art at ridiculously reduced prices to people he felt like were real fans and would actually appreciate the art despite his obvious distaste for assigning monetary values to it. It seems that while he might not be in love with his finished pages and illustrations in a lot of cases, he does get a kick out of people who truly like and enjoy his work getting to own originals. On the other hand, people that simply want his work as investment pieces or worse yet for a quick flip are a major issue for Michael Golden. He said on numerous occasions he does not like when monetary values are assigned to his work in general, and then he just kind of starts shutting down, losing interest, and eventually getting kind of disgusted by the entire situation when it does happen in most cases. I also know that this view of his original art eventually led to a pretty legendary dispute in the mid-80s that would basically sour Michael Golden on selling original art almost entirely for nearly 2 decades. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but even that debacle was seemingly nothing compared to the dispute that Michael Golden had with one of his inkers. The ensuing fallout from the clash that would result between he and the inker would not only lead to some truly shocking results, but what feels like something of a permanent black eye on his reputation in a lot of regards as well. Now, just because Michael Golden doesn't necessarily like to assign value to his work doesn't mean he's ignorant to it being valuable. He just doesn't like that part of the industry very much and does his best to avoid it as a result. When backed into a corner about this subject, Michael Golden has displayed a number of varied reactions, All of them, however, seem to be rather extreme to say the least, in my opinion. Perhaps the most notorious and least understood of these stories goes that at one point, Michael Golden was dealing with what he described as a problematic and greedy inker, although again, he refused to identify this inker by name. Golden says that once the project, which he also refused to give up, was done and the original art was getting returned to everyone involved, this inker decided that they had done the lion's share of the work, not Michael Golden. Now, to be clear, if you've ever seen Michael Golden's finished pencils, you'll almost immediately know that this guy was most likely totally full of crap. Golden's roughs and breakdowns are sparse and certainly open to interpretation. When he buckles down and he completes finished pencils, however, this is an entirely different scenario. Despite the inordinate amount of details, as well as his high standards for those working on his material, Golden really does provide some of the tightest and easiest to interpret work in the industry when doing full pencils. Regardless, for anyone who's not familiar, when you're done with an issue, pages of original art are distributed to those that worked on the issue. Sometimes there's a prearranged upon amount of pages that go to people like inkers, writers, and pencilers, and other times it's left up to them. But in almost every case, the actual decision of what pages go to who is left up to those that worked on the material in question. In this case, pages had already been selected and the split of art between everyone had already been agreed upon before the sudden change of heart on the inker's part, according to Michael Golden's accounts. After some quibbling back and forth over the subject, with this inker refusing to back down at all, there was eventually a pretty big fight about it. And in the end, despite the blow-up, nothing was really resolved, and Michael Golden, who at this point was done with the entire situation, basically told him, fine, you know what? I'll just send you the pages. Which technically he did, although I don't think that things worked out the way that the inker had hoped when he went to war over them. Golden did send him the pages, but before he did so, Michael Golden apparently tore every single one of them to shreds. Golden then proceeded to stuff the remains into an envelope and mail them to the inker, saying that if he really wanted them, he could have them. All he had to do was paste them together and he could sell them then. While this is the only time that I'm aware of Michael Golden destroying his own art like this, the opening lines to his 1997 Wizard interview, the first interview he had given since 1979, even talked about how he was quote-unquote as likely to tear up a page as keep or sell it, most likely because of this incident. Yes, obviously, there was something of a precedent for this kind of thing happening in the technical sense, but the article makes it seem like Michael Golden was simply purposely destroying his art so that other people couldn't enjoy it or own it or profit off of it, which obviously simply is not the truth. This is the same kind of malarkey that you hear leveled at Steve Ditko, who is accused of using what little original art that Marvel ever bothered to return to him as cutting boards or leaving them sitting around to decay and languish unappreciated and forgotten in his apartment. When you're not there to dispel these things, and in the case of both Ditko and Golden, I don't think really care, the stories really start to fly. With this extended absence from the industry, there was an increasingly large element of urban myth surrounding Golden, especially concerning his behind-the-scenes antics and treatment of original art that we're going to really analyze and pull apart later. I do have to say, in the case of the Marvel Fanfare story renovation, I feel like Michael Golden probably wasn't exaggerating when he said he would have just torn up the pages, and that's the truth. That, however, would have been an absolute travesty given what eventually became of the material. According to Michael Golden, even after he repeatedly refused to redraw the ending, Al Milgrom kept at him for a while in hopes of getting him to do something with it. But Golden assumed that he eventually just had to move on and forgot about getting Golden to do it as he stopped calling. Pretty disgusted by the entire experience and burnt on comics once again, Golden absolutely refused to do any further work on the story, and Milgrom couldn't do anything with it in the form that it was, so it just sat, like so many other publications throughout Michael Golden's career, unused in a desk drawer. Renovation was slightly different, however, as Golden simply assumed that Milgrom had either chucked the entire thing into the trash can after his refusal to work on it, or that he reassigned the work to someone else, which, for the record, is what Michael Golden says he would have done in this situation. What Michael Golden didn't know was that instead of reassigning Renovation, or even getting someone else to do finishes over Golden's pencils, Al Milgrom had instead simply put it into storage. This wasn't because Al Milgrom didn't know what to do with the story, or even because he was angry and didn't want to publish it or anything, though. He actually did this in order to preserve what he saw as some of Michael Golden's finest work to date, refusing to let anyone else touch the material that Michael Golden had turned in. Al Milgrom safely tucked away the story into a file until he caught Golden on another good day, and he could talk him into finishing the story. That is, at least according to Michael Golden. Al Milgrom shared a slightly different version of events, to say the very least, but that was decades later in an interview, and as always, we'll talk about that when we get there. Despite their conflicting accounts, Renovation wouldn't see print for some time, and Golden was none too happy about the entire situation. Following the release of Fast Descent to Hell and To Sacrifice My Soul, if Micronauts hadn't been a rough enough ride, the Marvel fanfare experience having to do with Renovation in 1982 left such a bitter taste in Michael Golden's mouth that he was already thinking about making a hasty exit from the comic industry for the more monetarily rewarding field of commercial work once more. Thankfully, Golden chose to stick around for just a while longer, and despite his mounting frustrations with the industry, he would release not only one of his best stories, but what is widely considered to be one of the best Doctor Strange stories ever, To Have Loved and Lost in Doctor Strange issue 55, published in October of 1982. Golden had previously contributed several covers to the series and even done a backup feature, A Moment's Peace, a year prior in issue 46. Something had dramatically changed about Golden's art, however, and he'd made immeasurable improvements with both his narrative and sequential storytelling. Not to mention, the compositions and illustrations are especially luscious and ethereal considering the functionality that Michael Golden expected of them. For Golden, To Have Loved and Lost was just another assignment at the time, though, and especially because it was simply a fill-in issue, he says he didn't give it an inordinate amount of thought when he was working on it. And if you're starting to notice a reoccurring pattern here with the need for Golden to separate himself from his more compulsive artistic tendencies in order to meet deadlines or not taking stuff super seriously, leading to the creation of some of his best, most memorable works, you're not alone. Given that To Have Loved and Lost probably became Golden's most influential story, with the exception of perhaps one other, and is cited by so many people as the entire reason that they got into comic books to begin with, or is what they aspire to when creating books themselves for that matter, it's kind of funny to hear Michael Golden, who is pretty dismissive of it in a lot of ways, talk about working on it. While to Golden, To Have Loved and Lost was just another assignment, when pressed or drawn into conversation about the story, even he has to admit that you can see a quantum leap in his art style between it and even To Sacrifice My Soul, which he did right around the same time. Golden says the major reason for the almost unbelievable artistic evolution present in To Have Loved and Lost is that he was doing more commercial art at the time. As a result, Golden was expanding his artistic horizons through his experiences in that field, systematically learning and growing from each successive assignment. Michael Golden was developing a lot as an artist during this period, but ironically, he says it was mostly due to his work outside the confines of the comic book industry that were responsible for this. Golden often says that there is no impetus to grow or evolve as a comic book artist inside of the industry, and that it teaches you time-saving shortcuts and other methods that end up compromising the quality of your work in order to meet deadlines and make the corporate machine backing you happy not to be a better artist. Commercial work was extremely demanding, but Michael Golden found that among other things, it was making him an infinitely better draftsman because the impetus was on solid quality work and not just finding ways to cut corners. And if you look at his work prior to this and following it, there's little argument to be made here that regardless of whether it was his commercial work making him better or not, it was monumentally better. In many ways, To Have Loved and Lost is the first time that you really see the fully formed Michael Golden that most people know and love today truly let loose on the page. There's a fluidity and a confidence that, while to some extent had always been evident in Michael Golden's work prior to this, feels like it was still developing and evolving in a lot of regards. Golden had a unique voice, but it was with To Have Loved and Lost that he finally found his style. And this did not go unnoticed. To Have Loved and Lost would not only catch the eye of fans and critics alike, but as I mentioned, actually become one of the most cited stories as to why professionals got into the industry, as you're likely to find. While it's evident that Michael Golden was undoubtedly learning a great deal from his commercial endeavors, it seems that another thing which likely contributed to the awesome quality of this story was the strict 2-week deadline that Golden found himself under to pencil the entire thing. Probably a mixture of the growing experience that he was racking up while doing commercial work, teamed with the years he'd spent in the industry and topped off by the fact that he had little time to second guess himself or go back and rework his initial compositions. Michael Golden produced what many consider his best story in To Have Loved and Lost. Golden has never personally seemed too impressed with the story in and of itself, though, while admitting to the dramatically better art, and instead mostly recalls that it was yet another case of the bait and switch tactic on Marvel's end, explaining that the 2-week deadline that he had was not part of the original agreement. When Michael Golden took the assignment for Doctor Strange 55, he claims that he was pretty upfront with Marvel, telling them that he was extremely busy with a bunch of other stuff and that he would get to the story when he could. Golden says that Marvel told him to take his time and not stress over it, explaining that he would have something like 3 months to complete the story. Apparently, when Michael Golden turned in his first splash page for the story, though, everyone knew it was something special and they got excited. Once again, without Golden's knowledge or consent, upon seeing his work, Marvel decided to put the story on the schedule right then, thereby killing any lead time that he had on the story that he was supposed to have. According to Michael Golden, a short while later, he received a frantic phone call asking where the story was, informing him that he didn't actually have 3 months to work on the story, but that they were, of course, already behind schedule. As a result, several months turned into getting the story done as quickly as he possibly could, and plans for work on the story quickly changed as a result as well. Because Golden was originally going to be given some 3 months, he'd planned to pencil and ink and color the entire story himself like he had with the earlier Marvel fanfare work. When the timetable for the story changed, however, Golden was forced to relinquish several duties on the book, including inking. While for some pencilers, this might not be such a big thing, when Michael Golden inks his own works, he basically does rough layouts, and I do mean rough. There's little to no detail and only the most general sense of what a page is going to look like in its final form. Golden employs this technique so that, in his own words, he doesn't end up having to essentially draw stuff twice. When word came down that he wasn't going to be able to ink the story because of the deadline change, Golden was forced to change things up and began tightening down his pencils from page to page as the issue progressed, though. He, however, did not go back and redraw the first several pages of roughs that he'd already completed when he thought that he was still going to be the one inking the story. This is why, if you look at Doctor Strange 55, the first 3 pages in particular look nothing like the rest of the book. Whereas the rest of To Have Loved and Lost was done in Golden's more recognizable, extremely intricate and detailed pencil style, inker Terry Austin, who is essentially like the go-to inker for Marvel at this point, was called in to actually do finishes on the first few pages using only Golden's rough pencils, much like Joe Rubinstein had been on the first issue of Micronauts, actually. This unique set of circumstances created an incredibly interesting blend of styles, in my opinion, and while Michael Golden has never spoken highly of a single inker in his entire career, I always personally felt like Terry Austin did a pretty amazing job of extenuating the best parts of Michael Golden's style, which by happenstance were just starting to become apparent in Golden's work for the first time. Doctor Strange 55 was kind of a perfect storm, and while Michael Golden might be somewhat personally dismissive of the story, this is the case for a lot of his comic book work, and I think that its importance is often overlooked by a great deal many people when examining the industry as well as Golden's career. His influence on the generation of creatives that would be entering the industry, like Todd McFarlane, Mark Silvestri, and Rob Liefeld, as well as plenty of those that were already there, like Arthur Adams, cannot be overstated, and a huge part of that was To Have Loved and Lost. It's insane to look at To Have Loved and Lost, knowing that Michael Golden was turning out nearly 2 pages of fully finished pencils for the story a day. What's even crazier to me in a lot of ways is that Michael Golden had never even drawn Doctor Strange before the backup story done a year prior to this. While the pressure of having to pencil an entire story in 2 weeks can sometimes have less than optimal effects on people, and to be clear, Golden does consider To Have Loved and Lost a quote-unquote rush job in his description, this seems to be when Michael Golden really shines. When Golden is dead set on meeting a deadline, and granted that's not a common occurrence, but when it does happen, it seems like this somehow frees him artistically to a certain extent, and that a great deal of his most well-known and widely respected works were created under these same sorts of strenuous conditions, which I find extremely interesting. To Have Loved and Lost was so well received that famed portfolio producer Sal Cortuccio actually ended up commissioning a series of illustrations from Golden for a proposed Doctor Strange portfolio almost immediately following Doctor Strange 55's release. While it would take Michael Golden more than a year to even start the illustrations for the portfolio, which would be canceled and resolicited at least twice as a result of this, the work that he did eventually produce was jaw-dropping. Even now, decades later, both his work on the Doctor Strange series as well as the portfolio are well remembered by Strange fans as some of the pinnacles of artistic representations of the character. None of this seemed to click with Michael Golden, though. While appreciative of the praise, To Have Loved and Lost was just another job to Michael Golden. While he admits that his art was obviously getting better, it was done under a deadline, and he ended up having to make a lot of artistic sacrifices on the story in his eyes because of this. As a result, Golden seems genuinely confused as to why people are so obsessed with Doctor Strange 55 all these years later. In the face of the immense popularity of To Have Loved and Lost, due to the difficulties he had encountered on both Micronauts as well as Renovation, the Marvel fanfare story that was currently rotting in Al Milgram's drawer somewhere in the Marvel offices, he once again opted to concentrate on his commercial endeavors, stepping back from comic book interiors once again. It wouldn't be until some 15 months later, in January of 1984, that he would produce another full-length story, opting to mostly stay peripherally involved with comics instead, and specifically in his role as a cover artist rather than an interior one, which suited both his bank account and schedule better despite not being creatively fulfilling enough for the artist. While one might hope that after such a long absence, Michael Golden would have come back and had a wonderful time on his next venture for Marvel, and that things went smoothly so that he might be enticed to do a little bit more work than he had been up to this point. Again, sadly, this was most definitely not the case. Instead, X-Men Annual 7, released in January of 1984, once again simply helped reinforce Golden's distaste for the industry on nearly every level. The project seemingly started out like any other, except that this one didn't actually seem to be nearly as far behind as so many of the others that Golden had worked on for Marvel up to this point. This changed, however, and I was never able to find details as to exactly why. Regardless, it was decided for whatever reason that the book needed to be out on stands as soon as possible. I'm not talking about getting the book done quickly. I'm talking about all hands on deck, 5-alarm fire, full-on emergency status. While I have no clue why they needed the book out so badly, this rush job resulted in Marvel recruiting no less than 11 different people to ink the 40-page story, which Golden only ended up completing pencils for roughly 34 of. Brett Blevins, Sam De La Rosa, Art Adams, and Elliot Brown were all also brought on to either pencil pages or finish Golden's roughs for the other 6 pages on top of the plethora of inkers that were involved as well. What resulted was an absolutely horrendous mishmash of different styles that unsurprisingly did not work. Golden was understandably disappointed as well as frustrated with the outcome, and honestly, after Golden sitting on the sidelines for more than a year as far as interiors, you would have thought that Marvel would put just a slight bit of TLC into the work that he was producing. This never seemed to be the case, however, and there's actually a few possible reasons for this. Chief among these possible reasons is that I don't know if Michael Golden was his own best advocate. While I think defensible considering how good a lot of his stuff turned out, Golden could get pretty vocal about aspects of books that he wasn't super pleased with behind the scenes. Golden's outspoken nature and intense wish to produce the best material that he possibly could very well may have actually been why Golden wasn't doing a ton of interiors, honestly. While Michael Golden claims that he was concentrating on commercial stuff and turning down a lot of comic book work, it could easily be that he was simply considered too vocal and beginning to be regarded as something of a liability rather than an asset when he was brought on board for projects in a lot of ways. Either way, while Michael Golden has never been a huge fan of being the cover guy, and he doesn't really see himself in that way at all, he does happen to be pretty freaking amazing at it and was still taking on steady work in those regards. As a result, his interior artwork wasn't the only thing improving during this period, and Golden was also producing some of the most interesting covers of his entire career. Golden did his first fully painted cover work for Cole the Conqueror #4 in February 1984 and The Savage Sword of Conan 98 in March of that same year. Both were done in gouache, but Golden was never happy with how they or any other paintings, for that matter, reproduced at the time. Because of how the CMYK color printing process worked, you lost a ton of details in your line work, and the colors were either muted or muddied in the final product. Given the limitations of the printing process at the time, most people felt like there simply wasn't much avoiding this, but Michael Golden was determined to do something about it. Golden believed that most likely the line work at least could be improved upon if someone were inclined to work on a much larger scale, reasoning that when the art was reduced, this would help to preserve some of the finer details. He also reasoned that the reduction process would help to conceal any small mistakes a little bit, losing some of them and disguising others in the reproduction process. Because of this, as well as his admitted experience with paintings, when he originally started doing the gouache covers, Golden went oversized with everything. I don't know how much tightening up he thought his line work needed, but apparently it had to have been a lot because his first paintings were absolutely enormous, measuring between 3 and 4 feet tall. Even with the increased size to compensate for his line work, which worked to an extent, Golden was still extremely unhappy with how the color reproductions on the paintings were. So Golden began to experiment, integrating more and more of the commercial painting elements that he'd spent years honing at this point, especially airbrushing in an attempt to get better results. As he became more comfortable with painting, Golden was also able to gradually step down the size of his pieces, eventually arriving at the much more reasonable and traditional size of 11 by 17 before long. While more comfortable with doing painted covers, as well as more versed in how they reproduced, after more than a year and a half of experimentation, Golden was still displeased with the results he was achieving. He was so unhappy with the paintings, in fact, that in 1985, when Larry Hama approached him about doing a series of proposed G.I. Joe covers, Michael Golden knew it was time for yet another agonizing reappraisal of the situation. After months of beating his head against the wall and fighting the lackluster results this garnered him, Golden had something of an epiphany that would open a host of new artistic opportunities to him. During his time in commercial work, he'd come across a process called blue line, where you would shoot the line art, have that printed out on clear mylar, and then mount that over a piece of Bristol or other artboard. You would then paint the colors directly on the backing artboard with the clear mylar that had all the clean line art sitting on top of the colored backing board, much like an animation celluloid. Golden reasoned that while there wasn't much you could do about the limited color printing techniques, using this blue line process to shoot the line art on top of the colors as a separate sheet would greatly help to maintain the quality and clarity atop the painted colors, as opposed to other techniques being employed at the time. The thing was, the blue line process was expensive. On top of this, it wasn't easy to find people to even do these transfers in the early 80s. Eventually, after some trial and error, Golden got the idea to do his rough pencils directly on the backing board and then do his inks on a clear piece of vellum or mylar that he attached atop them. Once he inked his line work on the mylar sheet, he could go back and paint over his pencils on the backing board, essentially replicating the process himself in the studio for a fraction of the cost. This process is probably best exemplified by the series of jaw-dropping G.I. Joe covers that Golden produced a few months later, starting in March of 1985, as he grew much more confident and comfortable with the techniques. The Joe covers in particular went over really well and turned a lot of heads, making a big splash with fans and eventually leading to Golden's single-issue masterpiece and perhaps the most influential and widely celebrated story of his entire career roughly a year later. While this blue line process would actually go on to become something of an industry standard, Golden was one of, if not the first, to apply the process to comics that I'm aware of. The results were unlike anything anyone had seen at the time, and Michael Golden found himself even more in demand as a cover artist as a result. In July of 1984, Golden also produced what is undoubtedly his most famous cover, though it's not necessarily famous for the reasons that one might think. In fact, it may even be more infamous than anything else at this point. Golden did the cover art for issue 8 of an obscure yet equally interesting series, The Saga of Crystar, Crystal Warrior, and while far from well known by a lot of comic book fans, the book would go on to produce one of the most memorable and profitable images of Golden's entire career, although he'd never see a single penny of it. The story behind this cover is so interesting that rather than spend an inordinate amount of time here and get totally sidetracked with it, that I've decided to produce a standalone special about the cover that will be available once this series is wrapped up. I don't mean to be a tease, but it truly is a tale unto its own, and Golden was producing some of the most interesting and radically different work of his entire career during this period, and I really want to get into that, but I know people are going to ask about that cover. Well known for his covers by this point, people were ravenous for more interiors from Michael Golden though. Unfortunately, a great deal of the material that was announced Michael Golden would be doing interiors for never ended up happening for a host of reasons though. Few of these projects had been in the works as long as the Next to See publication had, however, and even fewer of them ever actually managed to see the light of day following such delays. After more than half a decade, a name change, and several false starts and solicitations, in April of 1984, the first part of a long-hyped, serialized series of stories about a world of anthropomorphic animals locked in an epic space battle began publication in the pages of Neal Adams' anthology series, Echo of Future Past. While the project wouldn't go on to have the lasting impact that some of his other work did with other artists or even a lot of comic book fans, money-wise, this title has to be the biggest thing that Michael Golden was ever involved with. By now known as Bucky O'Hare, the project was in fact the same series initially titled Bucky Bunny that Larry Hama had initially gotten Golden to do work with him on while still at DC way back in 1978 when he was just getting into the industry. As you can imagine, given that 6 years had passed, a lot of stuff changed between 1978 when DC dropped the ball and Hama had taken the property to Neal Adams continuity, and 1984 when the first serialized Bucky O'Hare story finally appeared in print. By the time of its release in July of 1984, most people that weren't directly involved with the series assumed that Bucky O'Hare had either simply been shelved because it was never completed, or that if it had been finished, Adams had chosen not to publish it for one reason or another that no one seemed to be able to figure out. Especially considering there had been a good amount of talk and discussion about the series as early as 1980, and I'm not just talking about the nebulous promise of a series being made by one person or another offhandedly in an interview, as often happens with Michael Golden. There had been an actual preview page published by the Comics Journal along with a promise of an upcoming solicitation of Bucky O'Hare in 1980 as part of an announcement by a European company that they had licensed Bucky O'Hare internationally through Neal Adams continuity and were going to be publishing the series overseas in Europe. When the series failed to materialize after several months and then more than a year, many people wrote it off. Neal Adams continued to bring it up in interviews in the intervening years, however, and it became clear that while the series was still being actively developed and worked on, Adams didn't think that the material that had been completed was ready to see publication for years for some reason. Many began to speculate that Michael Golden, who was developing something of a reputation for not being able to meet deadlines, deserved or not, by this time, was the reason that the series was taking so long because he couldn't get the art done or that Neal Adams wasn't happy with what he was turning in. While in reality, the reason, or more accurately reasons, that Bucky O'Hare took so long to come out aren't exactly defined, they deal instead with the changes the series saw during the time between its initial conception and publication, and I think it's safe to assume that although Golden isn't the fastest guy on the planet and likely wasn't rushing anything, I don't think it's fair to claim he was the sole reason that the series took so long to come out either. Larry Hama had originally planned on drawing Bucky O'Hare himself at one point actually. Once he brought Golden on board and saw his initial concept and design work and what he was capable of achieving with that sort of material, he quickly realized that Michael Golden was the one who should be drawing the book though. Absolutely blown away by what Michael Golden was able to achieve in the genre, Hama became pretty entrenched in the idea that Golden should be the artist on the book. This was when he was at DC though. Once Bucky O'Hare got licensed by continuity, this could have easily changed and Hama could have had no say in the matter. As it happens, it seems that Larry Hama wasn't alone though, and Neal Adams, who waited quite literally years for the Bucky O'Hare material to see publication, was obviously of the same mindset as well. The road to publication wasn't a short or easy one for Bucky O'Hare, but it would definitely prove to be worth the time and effort. When I originally started digging around, I thought there might have been production delays on continuity's end delaying the series' release. I then began to wonder if Golden had indeed been the holdup and simply taken this long to get the material completed, but neither one of these things on their own appear to have been the case. More than anything, I think it was Neal Adams getting things the way that he wanted them with Bucky O'Hare, and more importantly, Continuity Comics off of the ground, a feat which took him some time. Adams explicitly states as early as 1982, a full 2 years prior to the publication of the first serialized Bucky O'Hare story, during a Comics Journal interview outlining Continuity's upcoming publications, which wouldn't actually start coming out until around July of 1984, that 2 years after the initial promise of solicitation, they were still actively working on the series. Adams went on to explain that there had been, quote, more complications with the series than he was comfortable with, but that it would, quote, be worth the wait when it finally did get done. Although obviously this book took a little longer than I think anyone involved anticipated, it obviously didn't take Michael Golden 5 years to draw Bucky O'Hare, but I do believe that it took him several years to manage to get stuff the way that Neal Adams and Continuity Comics wanted it for publication, as well as fit it in his own schedule, and for the publishers themselves to be ready to release the series. Spending several years on a single project, especially something like Bucky O'Hare, was a big gamble on Adams' part, and it could have easily backfired. Thankfully, Adams was a shrewd businessman and had been working every angle he possibly could while Bucky O'Hare was being completed and they were getting Continuity Comics off of the ground. As it turned out, the gambit would pay off for Adams as well as everyone else involved in spades. Kind of ironically, I think it was actually some of these deals Adams was putting together during the interim between conception and publication that would prove to be extremely lucrative, but also dramatically alter where the series was going and what it was about, thereby dictating that changes be made to the story, and in turn the art, thereby setting the series almost perpetually behind schedule in the seemingly never-ending cycle of revisions due to licensing deals and other outside influences. Way back in 1978, the series had started life as Bucky Bunny at DC, where Hama tried repeatedly to pitch the series as one of what would have been the publisher's first creator-owned titles. DC, however, perpetually dragged their feet concerning drawing up any sort of actual contract or offering any kind of written agreement having to do with the property at all, while at the same time asking Hama to see more and more material. Knowing just how easy it was to clone a book and therefore not wanting to give too much away before DC agreed to anything, Hama eventually decided to walk from the deal and ended up at Neal Adams' then upstart publishing company Continuity instead. While Hama had been weary of DC anyways, the decision to entirely part ways with them was apparently ultimately done on the advice of Hama's lawyer, a guy named Ed Priest. And if the name Ed Priest sounds familiar, that's probably because he's the guy who represented Siegel and Schuster during their protracted legal battle with DC over Superman during this period. Having seen the worst of what the company was truly capable of, Priest reportedly told Larry Hama that verbal agreements were only worth the paper that they were printed on, and that he should look elsewhere if DC wasn't going to put anything in writing. This was when Hama found continuity, and the series began to radically undergo innumerable changes, rendering it almost unrecognizable from its original form, which was anything but the family-friendly anthropomorphic animal book that we eventually saw. Golden says that originally the series was going to be more of an adult-oriented space drama, very much in the vein of Star Wars, which was a relatively fresh concept in 1978 when Hama and Golden first started working on the series. However, once Adams took over the series, he decided that not only did the name need changing due to possible confusion with a certain famous wisecracking carrot-consuming cartoon character, but that the entire thing needed a basic overhaul. Adams felt that they should play up the more cartoony aspects and make it more approachable to kids, leaning into the anthropomorphic animal thing. He wanted to make it more family friendly, with aspirations that they would be able to pitch the story to multimedia companies in hopes of scoring a television show or movie deal to support the book, or vice versa. As a result, many of the initial concepts and designs had to be radically reworked in order to fit into this new construct, with Golden actually referencing Robert Crumb's underground publications and contemporaries when talking about his initial mindset and how he approached his first work on Bucky Bunny. If Adams and Continuity were going for family-friendly, mainstream appeal, and Michael Golden was coming from the Robert Crumb underground school of thought, I don't know how much more of a diametrically opposite direction the art could have been forced to take, or how much of the initial work had to have been lost when this decision was made. Although things on Bucky O'Hare changed a lot, and this might have been slightly irritating to Michael Golden, who was having to constantly navigate his way through them, he still didn't have to draw superheroes, so apparently Golden wasn't really complaining, at least not at the time. While this decision to take Bucky O'Hare in a more child-friendly direction would ultimately prove to be a frustrating move for Golden, somewhat stymieing his creativity on the series in some regards, it would also ultimately lead to the eventual success of the franchise in a number of regards, and work out extraordinarily well for everyone involved, money-wise. Over the years, for a few reasons, Michael Golden was forced to rework character and vehicle designs. When Larry Hama initially brought him onto the series, despite already having designs that he'd drawn himself, he had Michael Golden redo nearly all of them from the ground up, due to what Michael Golden describes as, quote, Hama's displeasure with his own initial designs. As a result, Golden remembers having to basically entirely redo all of the characters for Bucky O'Hare during this period at DC, despite Hama having done fully realized concept work for the series himself already. Quote, Larry Hama had his own designs that he had done, all of which pretty much got scrapped. I always got the impression that he was pretty much unhappy with what he had done, and he really felt that it needed a whole new look and spin and everything else, and that's just why he got me on board. He handed me a folder full of his stuff, and in certain instances, it was a jumping off place. Like, say with Ginny, the witch cat, and I use that one because I seem to remember his original sketch being somewhat similar to what we ultimately went with, but Bucky was pretty much from scratch, and Blinky, the little robot, was close to Larry's original sketch also, except that I made him much more rounder and softer and cuter. Once Neil Adams came on board and they moved away from the more adult approach to the material, obviously adjustments had to be made once again to the Bucky O'Hare designs, and Golden was back at the drawing board though. Rather than getting bored or burnt out, the approach that Golden took with Bucky O'Hare, despite its more child-friendly appearance at this point, was no less meticulous than anything else that he ever did, and actually perhaps even more so than much of his other work. The character redesigns weren't even the only stumbling block in this regard, though. Another reason that Bucky O'Hare ended up taking so long, because it wasn't just characters that needed designing and or redesigning, it was the vehicles too, and they had to be good. A few years before, people had taken basically whatever they could get science fiction-wise, but that had all changed following the release of the Kenner Star Wars action figure line in support of A New Hope in 1978. Industrial Light and Magic didn't just revolutionize how people saw spacecraft on film, but ultimately led to complete rethinking of what was considered interesting and cool in the genre, and a big part of this was the toys. While there was no such thing as real home media when the original film was released and you only saw the intricately designed ships for the film for sometimes seconds on the screen, the Kenner toy line allowed people to not only play with them, but examine them up close and study them in detail. In the end, it wasn't the movie that ended up making everyone involved with Star Wars trillions of dollars. At least not at the time. It was the merchandising. The ensuing wave of toys that followed the film's release changed the face of that industry overnight and is still having echoing repercussions almost half a century later. They also ended up making Kenner around $100 million in 1978 alone. Following the success of the Kenner Star Wars toy line, everyone wanted a piece of the action, and the toy market quite literally exploded overnight, with investors hungry for a piece of the newfound potential in the industry. So, when it was decided by Neal Adams that there was going to be an inevitable line of Bucky O'Hare toys, knowing how much attention people were paying to designs and quality, a rather unique decision was made that I'm not sure I've ever heard of before. The characters and vehicles from Bucky O'Hare were actually designed all the way from their initial conception to the printed page to look exactly like they eventually would in toy form, quite literally down to the nuts and bolts. Golden, who already had a good amount of experience working with toys due to his time on Micronauts, along with Larry Hama, both happen to be fans of building and designing kits and models anyways, and they brought this knowledge and interest to the project as well. Together, they were able to extremely accurately design and then later translate those designs into 3 dimensions, really breathing life into the toys and making them some of the most accurate and interesting of their kind at the time. This desire to not change a single thing is why Golden's art for the comic features the same telltale 3mm holes in the feet and belts that the toys do. Every facet of the characters' appearances and design was given an inordinate amount of thought and consideration. It was an interesting idea for sure, but I'm not entirely convinced that it was worth the time and effort required given the limited success of the toy line ultimately. There was obviously much more going on with the production of this book than I think anyone knows, but finding details proved to be rather difficult. Most signs point to the major difficulties on the publication, and being that Adams encountered innumerable obstacles and difficulties when he tried to start Continuity Comics, and this delayed the start of not only Bucky O'Hare, but all of their comics that they had planned for release for a rather lengthy stint. What I know for sure as well is that even after Bucky O'Hare was published, it didn't do extraordinarily well in comic book form. Despite what seemed to be continual outcry for Golden to do more interiors, it doesn't appear there was much ruckus or fanfare following its release at all, actually. Not to be deterred, this makes what Hama, Golden, and Adams were eventually able to achieve with the series all that more impressive to me, though, honestly. Bucky O'Hare had taken nearly 4 years of legwork to even get to the point of publication. With this series receiving mixed reviews and earning few longtime fans at that point, it wouldn't be until nearly 7 years later, in 1991, that Adams would finally manage to accomplish what he truly set out to with the property. He got it licensed. Adams had displayed a great love and extreme amount of confidence that the property would be a smash hit if they could just manage to get it in front of the right people, and eventually Bucky O'Hare did land a host of different deals around the same time. Unfortunately, they all seem to have kind of revolved around one another in a rather tenuous way, actually relying on the success and interest generated by the others. There wasn't a movie deal, but Adams had managed to secure a cartoon adaptation of Bucky O'Hare, which was being called The Toad Wars. It was a fairly top-notch production for its day, and the animated series was handled by none other than Sunbow Productions. Sunbow was the company behind some of my absolutely favorite Marvel cartoons of the 1980s, specifically the Incredible Hulk cartoon, which I think is brilliant, and the Pride of the X-Men pilot, which I still think might be the best animated X-Men feature ever produced. If this wasn't enough, Bucky O'Hare and the Toad Wars was animated by none other than freaking ACOM. And if you're unfamiliar, ACOM was the company behind G.I. Joe, Transformers G1, plus X-Men and Batman the Animated Series, to name just a few of the insane things they've done over the decades. While it never really managed to find its footing and was received rather ambivalently, the cartoon was a top-notch affair and just part of what Adams had in store for the property. In addition to the Toad Wars cartoon, as part of what was quickly becoming something of a multimedia blitz at the time, not one but 2 video games were released by Konami that same year as well, one a cabinet to capitalize on the then still extremely popular public arcades, and the other a cartridge for the NES home game system. If this weren't enough, there was also the eventual toy line from Hasbro as prognosticated by the 3 men years earlier, although it did take nearly 6 years for those toys to see production after they were designed and the initial comic book story was released. While the months and years of work meticulously designing characters and vehicles that could be replicated quite literally down to the bolt eventually paid off in the form of the 10 figures and one ship that were released, the toy line was an unmitigated letdown despite attention to even the smallest details and what appeared to be a true interest and love of what they were putting out. The figures and packaging were done right, featuring box art by Michael Golden, and there were even character write-ups done as an homage to Hama's work on the G.I. Joe line as well, proving that people obviously knew what they were doing when it came to the production and design of the Bucky O'Hare toy line. Sadly, things didn't exactly go as planned with Bucky O'Hare at all. Even in 1991, at the height of its popularity, the Hasbro line seems to have been a big part of this. Hasbro happened to be going through some pretty major changes right around 1991, and unfortunately, I think this kind of killed the Bucky O'Hare toy line before it ever really got started in a lot of ways. Hasbro was exponentially expanding, having gone from annual sales of around $100 million a few years prior to $1.4 billion by 1989. While undoubtedly a good thing on paper, this was accomplished by purchasing several other companies as well as making some pretty aggressive moves into overseas markets that had evaded the company to that point. All of these efforts had been big gambles, but they had paid off in spades and been spearheaded by the same guy to boot. After several years pushing the company to new heights, the man responsible for these changes, Alan Heisenfeld, was getting ready to step down as president of Hasbro, however, and the reason that the Bucky O'Hare line went the way of the dinosaur basically came down to a changing the guards that took place at the company in 1992 as a result, in my opinion. In late 1991, Alan Heisenfeld, the guy responsible for the extreme success of the company over the last half-decade, was succeeded by his brother Steven, who took over as president of Hasbro, looking to expand even more than his brother, but dealing with an exponentially larger company by this point. Steven started by trying to eliminate the most obvious fat that he could identify. Almost immediately, Steven Heisenfeld noticed just about any toy line that Hasbro was putting out that wasn't bolstered by television or movies had been steadily tanking since the 80s. And I know what you're thinking, but Bucky O'Hare did have a cartoon. We just talked about it, and it did. But the Toad Wars cartoon only lasted 13 episodes before it was canceled, never really having a chance to find its footing. Without a cartoon, or at least the very least an ongoing comic book series to keep the property in front of people's faces, especially with the changes taking place at Hasbro, I don't think the toy line ever really stood a chance. Frustratingly, and to further complicate matters, the main reason that I've heard for the cancellation of the television series over the years? Why, the failure of the toy line, of course. Like I said, it was a carefully constructed house of cards that came tumbling down all too quick. While I think it was the more complex changing landscape at Hasbro, as well as the failure of the cartoon to blow up that led to the failure of the Bucky O'Hare toy line, Larry Hama, on the other hand, has always maintained that the failure of the line could be squarely placed on the extraordinarily poor way in which the production, distribution, and promotion of the line was handled. Hama says that not only was the original Hasbro line extremely poorly advertised outside of the campaigns that Adams and Continuity undertook themselves, but that Hasbro was obviously ambivalent about the line, dooming it from the onset through thoughtless production and shipping practices. This first line obviously consisted of some major characters, including Bucky himself, but also included much more generic characters like the Storm Toad Trooper as well. Rather than do what any intelligent and forward-thinking company would do and produce more of the major characters, Hama claims that Hasbro made a truly baffling decision and all of the figures were produced and shipped in equal numbers instead. This meant that a lot of kids who actually did go out looking for Bucky O'Hare figures were often left disappointed, being greeted by racks of nothing but Toad Air Marshals, Storm Toad Troopers, Deadeye Ducks, and Willie DeWitts instead. Well, you're going to find the misfits and outlying figures from any given line sitting around languishing on shelves, and this decision to underproduce the Bucky O'Hare figures probably did hurt the chances for the line, I don't think it single-handedly killed it like Larry Hama has always maintained. I believe with the poor advertising campaign, general lack of support that the line received, and even the thoughtlessness with which the production was approached, it feels like a property that was simply left in the dust after a major change-up at Hasbro that no one saw coming. Alan Heisenfeld had been heading up the company for years and was one of the guys who spearheaded Bucky O'Hare. When his brother Steven came in and tried to tighten things down and cut spending where they could, I think that Bucky O'Hare became something of a forgotten line, to be honest. Case in point, there was a second line of figures planned for the original Hasbro line, which were seemingly quickly abandoned almost as soon as Steven took over. The second series had obviously been planned from the inception, as they had notably chosen to leave out one of the major characters, Jenny, from the initial wave of figures in order to bolster sales on the second. While she was obviously never ultimately produced, there are fully finished prototypes that have surfaced over the years of Jenny, as well as a host of other figures and vehicles for the proposed second wave, including Kamikaze Camo, Pit Stop Pete, and Rumblebee. While there was obviously something of an audience for a time, following the cancellation of the cartoon and the toy line after 1993, Bucky O'Hare seemed to be something of a fever dream, all but forgotten except by kids that happened to catch the show on television when it was released or owned one of the toys by chance. Over the years, however, the comic as well as the toys and the games attracted something of a cult audience. With the rise of the internet and people able to converse and share their interests with one another for the first time, it became clear there was a definite outcry for someone to finish the work that Hasbro had begun so many years before. It would take some time, but in 2017, almost 34 years after the release of the first Bucky O'Hare story, Boss Fight Toys licensed the property again and began releasing new figures. Where the original Hasbro line managed to squeeze out 10 figures and a vehicle in a little under a year, Boss Fight only managed 9 figures in a little over 3 years before they ultimately lost the rights from Continuity, who simply weren't interested in continuing the figures. It might not be the biggest toy line or the longest lasting cartoon series, but Bucky O'Hare was definitely a big deal at the time. It was plastered on everything from clothes to watches and sleeping bags, puzzles and sticker books, and a ton of other merchandise for all of this madness surrounding the multimedia blitz in the early 1990s. At the time, it was originally released in 1984 as a serialized set of stories in comic form, though, as I said, Bucky O'Hare didn't really make much of a splash. Continuity did collect the original serialized chapters from Echo of Future Past into a graphic novel style trade paperback a little over a year after its completion in 1986, though. Further plans for a sequel appear to have been scrapped almost immediately following the series' initial release, however, indicating that, again, Bucky O'Hare simply did not perform up to the standards that Adams thought it should, despite his having an incredible amount of faith in the project that lasted for quite literally decades. While Larry Hama had already written a sequel, and Golden says that he actually finished drawing about half of the proposed work, to my knowledge, none of that art has ever seen the light of day. Golden says that some of it may have been repurposed over the years as promotional artwork or something along those lines, but that to the best of his knowledge, nothing has ever been done with that work either, which rather ironically seems to have been completely abandoned by the time the cartoon, video games, and toys were released in 1991 and never revived. I don't know if everything underperformed again to the point that they just never got to where they needed to be or what, but you would have imagined that a cartoon and a toy line based on a comic book would merit putting out more of said comic book. But I guess I'm wrong. With plans for the proposed sequel seemingly long since dead by 1991 when the cartoon and toys came out, Continuity did re-release the original Bucky O'Hare material by Michael Golden in what was supposed to be a 6-issue limited series in lieu of new material at that point. While it had originally been released as a series of short serialized pieces for Echo of Future Past and had to be slightly reformatted for publication when the original 1986 graphic novel version was released, For reasons which I could find absolutely zero explanation, Continuity chose to make numerous additional changes to the material when it was re-released as single issues in 1991. There were sections of not only the story and dialogue that were completely altered, but most interestingly, some art had actually been altered and added. While most of this consisted of stuff like blowing up panels and that sort of thing, shockingly, there was also completely new art, which was apparently not by Michael Golden, included as well. Golden confirmed in at least one interview that he was aware that Continuity had in fact hired someone to actually mimic his style in order to produce new panels, saying that while he wasn't privy to all of the details, he understood that the new material was mostly transitional, produced in order to help the story flow better in the new format in Neal Adams' eyes. While absolutely bizarre that Continuity even did it to begin with, I find it even stranger that Golden wasn't asked to contribute the new work for the series. This indicates one of two things to me, however. The first possibility is that Adams simply didn't want to pay for new material given how much of a financial flop that the first release had been. The second is that Neal Adams may have indeed been unhappy with Michael Golden or his work on Bucky O'Hare for one reason or another. The two men never worked together again that I know of, and neither have ever spoken to the details of this matter to the best of my knowledge, so we may never truly know. I suppose at least Continuity didn't hire a slouch, as Michael Golden did say that the artist they hired was so good even he couldn't tell the difference between his original art and the new stuff produced by someone else, which is pretty dang impressive. While there was a pretty concerted effort to get the Bucky O'Hare material back out there and renew interest in the property prior to the release of the cartoon and video games in 1991, I think that the comic once again dramatically underperformed, however. The main reason I'm convinced of this is because Continuity didn't even bother finishing the 6-issue Bucky O'Hare miniseries, instead abandoning publication with the 5th issue that clearly ended with a "to be continued" banner at the end and only one issue of material left to be collected from the original Echo of Future Past shorts. Funnily enough, as a bit of a side note here, this wasn't actually the only time that Michael Golden's original Bucky O'Hare material was tampered with for publication in comic book form either. When DC Thomson in the UK republished the original Echo of Future Past material in support of the release of the cartoon, they altered the dialogue, story, and some of the art as well, although they managed to republish all of Michael Golden's original work. I also can't speak as to whether the alterations in the Thomson editions are the same or differ at all from those made by Continuity for sure, as I've never actually gotten to read the DC Thomson versions of the books. Though from what I understand, these changes were unique to the UK version of Bucky O'Hare. Thomson, however, at least had something of a good reason for what they did, if my understanding is correct though. From all the information that I could find, the alterations that Thomson made to the Bucky O'Hare book were, for the most part, in order to get the comic material to fall more in line with the cartoon, which makes sense if you're marketing the comic as a spin-off from the show like they were. Thomson would go on to publish a further 14 issues of original material, drawing more extensively from the show only in the sense of utilizing characters that were designed and exclusively appeared in the cartoon. However, kind of interestingly, they themselves completely abandoned the plot from the cartoon almost immediately as well. Bucky O'Hare found little more success overseas, and the project quickly faded from most people's minds, however. Despite having completely disappeared from the public eye basically by 1994 for all intents and purposes, it's clear that Neal Adams still personally had high hopes for the property, actively shopping the series around, trying to raise interest, and even getting it optioned as late as 2007 when he did manage to attract the attention of Vanguard Publishing. Vanguard themselves decided to take a crack at repackaging the material again that same year and released what's now commonly referred to as the manga version of Bucky O'Hare. The Vanguard manga edition was actually just a smaller, digest-sized black and white version of the same material found in the original Continuity trade paperback. This time, however, it was printed directly from Golden's art and finally free from the coloring job which had obscured so much of his fine line work on the series. Rather than being artistically motivated, I think it's pretty clear that the decision to produce the material not only in black and white, but also the smaller digest size was done in order to mitigate printing costs and hopefully entice potential buyers at a much lower entry point who might be scared off with the increase in price required for either the addition of color or printing at the full traditional comic book size. Thankfully, however, in this case, it actually served the material really well, and the manga version went over fairly strong, selling out its initial print run in only a few months. It didn't do well enough for work on the sequel to be finally resumed, or even any of the art that was already done for it seeing the light of day, sadly, but it is nice to know that the Bucky O'Hare material is out there for an entirely new generation to enjoy, especially in a form where they can appreciate Michael Golden's intricate line work, which had been completely obliterated in earlier color editions. Golden had also commented on this in interviews and panels, saying how pleased he was with the Vanguard edition and how you were able to so clearly see the extremely well thought out line work he produced for the series for the first time. Golden also says that looking at the Vanguard edition is much easier to see similarities to his other work, despite the series being perceived as a pretty radical artistic departure for Michael Golden at the time. While Golden was known for a much more realistic approach and people were somewhat taken aback by the difference in style between Micronauts and Bucky O'Hare, he said for years that in reality, the series just let him lean into his natural proclivities as a more cartoony artist than anything else. This is no more evident than in the early characters that he'd done for Batmite's New York Adventure years prior at DC in the late 1970s, which were not only incredibly well done, but seemed to come to Golden almost instinctively. Interestingly, Golden's proclivity to lean into his more cartoonish style seems to have come out most often on his regular comic book when under rather extreme deadline pressures. In these cases, he was forced to dial down the extreme detail and compulsion to render every little thing in order to simply get the work completed in a logistical time frame, and this often resulted in some of his most widely celebrated work. While for a lot of people, meeting a deadline simply involves cutting corners and making lackluster art, this is not something that Michael Golden was interested or perhaps even capable of. Instead, in order to preserve the quality of his work in his eyes while still meeting his deadlines as best as he could, Michael Golden essentially developed an entirely different style that was just more suited for the shorter timetable work that he was required to do, employing it whenever he was in need. Looking back at his career, it's not difficult to see that Golden hadn't always just been capable of producing this style since the beginning, but that in fact, despite being pulled in a lot of other directions, it was probably more of his natural inclination than much of what actually saw publication. With this in mind and looking back at his career as a whole, this might not be all that startling today. However, I think it's important to remember that while Bucky O'Hare was being released in the pages of Echo of Future Past, the other big thing that Michael Golden had on the stands was the groundbreaking series of painted G.I. Joe covers that we talked about. Fans were flipping over the pieces, which were pushing painted reproduction to their limits and looked nothing like they had ever seen before, while also retaining Golden's much more well-known and realistic style. Despite perhaps being something of a footnote in his comic book career, the influence of Bucky O'Hare on the rest of his output is kind of unmistakable. And it's undeniable, too. Following the release of Bucky O'Hare, Michael Golden's proclivity for cartooning seemed to come out much more often than it ever had before, although to be fair, this could just as easily be because people found it more acceptable following a more long-form piece of work being done in that style, and he was simply finally starting to find his own voice, style, and footing in the industry as well as anything else. Bucky O'Hare had disastrously underperformed, and while it would eventually go on to make him more money than just about all of his other comic book work combined at that point, the series of G.I. Joe covers Golden had done for Larry Hama between 1984 and 1985 were all fans of the Joes, or Michael Golden for that matter, could talk about. Blown away by the blue line process that he was employing, fans were assured for more Michael Golden G.I. Joe. While this kind of stuff was usually a pipe dream, when it came to getting Michael Golden to do interior work, Larry Hama just so happened to be one of about maybe 3 or 4 people on the entire planet seemingly capable of talking Michael Golden into doing something that he wasn't 1000% sure about, or in some cases even really comfortable with. Knowing that he had always preferred science fiction, action, and adventure books over superhero stuff anyway, the longtime custodian of the Joes, Golden's partner on Bucky O'Hare, and old friend from DC, Larry Hama, decided that he was going to get Michael Golden to do an issue of G.I. Joe for him, come hell or high water. This, however, was much easier said than done. While Hama, for whatever reason, does seem to be one of the very few people capable of actually talking Michael Golden into doing something almost against his better judgment, this does not mean that it is easy for him. Still, with the clear goal of getting Michael Golden to do an issue of G.I. Joe based on the popularity of the amazing covers that he was contributing, as well as his love for the action and adventure genres in general, Hama set to work periodically calling Michael Golden and bugging him about doing an issue of G.I. Joe for him. Eventually, after contributing half a dozen covers and some sporadic illustrations, despite being extremely busy, which he always was, Golden says that Hama finally caught him on the right day. Golden explains that on that particular day, his desire to tell stories just so happened to outweigh the common sense part of his brain, telling him that he didn't have time to do the work and that it didn't pay enough to be worth the trouble. As a result, Golden did agree to do a G.I. Joe story for Larry Hama, but there was apparently some pretty major miscommunications from the very onset. Because of this, the story in question would barely manage to see print, and that would be almost a full year later in March of 1986, and this time it would not be because the story was languishing in some drawer somewhere. Join me next time when we'll get into Golden's revolutionary issue of G.I. Joe, as well as his much lauded run on The Nam, as well as so much more. But for now, I hope you all enjoyed, maybe even learned something. If you did like what you saw, make sure you hit that like button. Think about getting in the comments section below and letting me know. If you really enjoyed what you saw, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the link in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page. Remember, donations and subscriptions make future episodes possible. For as little as $3 a month, you get access to behind-the-scenes posts, early access to scripts, and audio for episodes before they're uploaded anywhere else. You can even get your name in the credits. If Patreon is not your thing, but you still want to support the channel, have no fear. You can sign up for membership right here on YouTube and get access to the scripts and audio, or use the Ko-Fi link in the description to make one-time donations. If that's not enough, you can even pick up your very own JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen now. As always, this has been a product of the Jerk Broadcasting System and brought to you by the generous grants from the viewers you see on the screen. I'd like to personally thank my loyal Wednesday Warriors, as well as Burnt Miller, Larry Nolan, and Shane Whitbread for research assistance and help tracking down interviews and articles, plus all of the members that you see on the screen for making this series possible. I know it took me a while to get this one done, but I hope it's been worth the wait, and I cannot wait for you all to see the rest of this series. Thanks again for sticking with me, and as always, I really, truly, and honestly ask only two things. Keep hitting those local shops, and keep reading comics.